They thought the new ER nurse was just another quiet pair of hands in scrubs. They had no idea she used to watch battlefields through a sniper scope until chaos tore through the trauma bay, and everyone in that room learned the same brutal truth at once. The calmest person in the room is often the most dangerous. This story begins in a military hospital on an ordinary American afternoon. Fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, tired operators waiting to get patched up after training. A young nurse moving from chart to chart without wasting a single motion. Nothing about her looks loud. Nothing about her asks for attention. And that is exactly why no one sees what's coming. But if you stay with this story, you'll see how pressure reveals character, how real strength hides in silence, and why some warriors never stop protecting people. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment where you're watching from. If the calmest person in the room is usually the one no one notices, then that afternoon in Portsmouth began, like so many dangerous afternoons do, with people looking in the wrong direction. At 12:54 p.m., Naval Medical Center Portsmouth looked almost peaceful from the outside. Sunlight lay across the brick walkways in hard white sheets. The air over the parking lot shimmered with summer heat rising off the asphalt. A helicopter moved somewhere in the distance, more vibration than sound, and the tide in the Elizabeth River threw sharp flashes of light against the glass entrance doors every time the wind shifted. Nothing about the building suggested violence. Nothing about the day hinted at the kind of moment that could split an ordinary shift in half and leave everyone inside it changed. Inside the emergency department, the air turned cold and dry and smelled faintly of antiseptic coffee and the metallic sting of overused machinery. The waiting area was not crowded by civilian standards, but it had the unmistakable energy of a military hospital after a training cycle. Sunburned sailors sat with taped wrists and swollen knuckles. A corpsman in green scrubs walked briskly past with a stack of intake papers pressed flat against his chest. A middle-aged chief with a wrapped ankle argued softly with the receptionist about whether he really needed crutches. Somewhere down the hall a child cried once, then fell silent. The overhead lights hummed with that sterile hospital brightness that made every face look more tired than it already was. Behind the triage counter, Lauren Cade moved through her work with the economy of someone who never wasted motion. She was 29 years old and had the kind of face people remembered only after they had spent enough time around her to notice the details. Dark hair pinned into a tight bun, clear skin touched by long shifts and little sleep, eyes that never looked hurried even when her hands were moving quickly. Her navy scrubs were neat sleeves rolled just once above the wrist, her identification badge clipped precisely where policy required it. Nothing flashy. Nothing careless. Her shoes made almost no sound as she crossed the floor. She checked a suture tray, peeled back one corner of sterile packaging, paused, and replaced the kit entirely because one instrument sat 2 millimeters out of line. She moved to a monitor, ran the cord through her fingers, tightened the connection, checked the reading, and signed off on the form attached to the clipboard. A corpsman near the medicine fridge asked whether Bay 3 had been cleaned and turned over yet. Lauren answered without looking up. 10 minutes ago. You already called it in. I called it in 12 minutes ago. The corpsman smiled despite himself. Copy that. Lauren gave him the smallest nod and stepped aside so he could pass. Her expression never hardened, but it did not soften much either. She worked with a kind of quiet certainty that made people lower their voice around her without meaning to. At the far end of the waiting area sat 4 Navy SEALs still wearing the residue of a brutal week near Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek. Salt dried pale across their sleeves. One man had a strip of athletic tape hanging loose from the heel of his palm. Another had a fresh abrasion along the ridge of his jaw where stubble met sunburn. They had the loose posture of men who had spent years in discomfort and no longer treated it like an inconvenience. Even sitting down, they altered the atmosphere around them. Their presence pushed into the room the way weather pushed into a harbor. Chief Petty Officer Nate Walker occupied the center chair like it belonged to him. He was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and built with the kind of calm power that usually made strangers step aside without being asked. There was intelligence in his face, but also the easy arrogance of a man who was rarely wrong in spaces that rewarded violent speed and confidence. He had a cut across 2 knuckles and a strip of dried mud along his forearm that no amount of wiping had fully removed. To his right sat Dylan Rook, thicker through the chest and neck, his posture looser, his expression permanently halfway between suspicion and amusement. He was the kind of operator whose silence usually meant he had already assessed everyone in the room and filed them away under useful or irrelevant. Across from them, Micah Velez leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, turning a hospital wristband over between his fingers like he was bored enough to pick a fight with plastic. Ben Mercer sat slightly apart from the others, not distant, just observant. He had the stillness of a man who listened first and spoke after he understood the shape of a room. Walker tipped his head back against the wall and let out a breath. "I swear, this is the first cold air I've felt in 3 days." Micah looked around at the fluorescent ceiling and the old magazines on the side table. Luxury living. Dylan rolled one shoulder, then the other, working out the stiffness. "I would trade all of this for 1 hour of sleep." Walker smirked. "You would trade state secrets for 1 hour of sleep." "That depends," Dylan said. "Do I get a pillow?" Micah chuckled. "Not in this building." Their laughter carried across the waiting room with the unforced volume of men who had never spent much time worrying about whether they were taking up too much space. Walker glanced toward the triage desk where Lauren was entering notes into a tablet without missing a beat. "New nurse." Micah followed his gaze. "Looks like it." Dylan squinted. "She looks young." Walker gave a low hum. "She looks like she still apologizes when patients thank her." Ben did not laugh right away. He was watching Lauren slide a blood pressure cuff back into a drawer and adjust the angle of a rolling stool so it no longer blocked part of the aisle. "She moves like she knows what she's doing," he said. Walker shrugged. "Hospital knows what it's doing is not the same as real pressure." Micah leaned back. "Come on, Chief. Do not start. I'm serious." Walker spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. "This place is a safe box. Climate control, clean floors, paperwork, and people whose worst day usually still ends in a bed with wheels." Dylan tilted his head toward Lauren. "Think she's ever seen anything uglier than a bad laceration and a panicked spouse?" Micah snorted. "If she works military medicine, she has seen some things." Walker glanced over again. Lauren had one hand on a chart and one on the edge of the desk, her posture straight, chin slightly lowered, as she listened to an older veteran explain his symptoms. "I'm sure she's competent," he said. "I'm just saying there's competent and then there's tested." The older veteran in front of Lauren was in his late 70s. Narrow-shouldered now, but clearly built hard once the kind of man age thinned without ever quite softening. He sat in a wheelchair with one hand pressed lightly against his ribs as he fought for a comfortable breath. His cap rested in his lap. His skin had the waxy pallor of somebody who had not been feeling right for longer than he wanted to admit. Lauren crouched just enough to bring herself into his line of sight. "Mr. Donnelly, I need you to take another slow breath for me." He managed half of one and winced. "Hurts on the right?" she asked. He nodded. "When did it start getting worse?" "This morning," he said, then paused to catch air. "Maybe before. I thought it would pass." Lauren glanced once at the pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, once at the slight strain in the tendons of his neck, then wrote something on the chart. "We're moving you closer to the desk," she said. "I want eyes on you." He gave her a tired look. "That bad? It is bad enough that I'd rather not have to come looking for you." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough. "That means yes. That means I like being prepared." She wheeled him herself, guiding the chair into a position that gave her a clean sight line from the triage counter, and kept him clear of the direct path between the main corridor and the treatment bays. Most people would not have noticed that she had just improved his safety without making a production of it. Ben noticed. Walker was still talking. "You spend enough time in the field, and you can tell who has had to make a real decision with consequences. It sits different on them. Micah raised an eyebrow. You planning to profile the entire staff while you wait for stitches? Better than listening to you complain about the coffee. The coffee here tastes like hydraulic fluid. That is because you would drink hydraulic fluid if someone served it hot. Dylan laughed under his breath, then nodded toward Lauren as she turned away from Mr. Donnelly and moved to the medicine station. She heard you. Walker barely looked bothered. Good. Maybe she'll tell us if I'm wrong. Lauren crossed to the counter, printed a patient label, and reached for a fresh pair of gloves. She had heard every word. The men were not trying especially hard to hide what they thought of her, and they did not need to. She had worked around men like that before, men whose lives taught them to measure competence through visible strain, loud skill, and the kind of confidence that announced itself before anyone asked. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes the loudest person in the room really was the most capable. Not always. A young intern appeared beside her, carrying 3 charts of stethoscope, and the anxious expression of someone who had not yet learned how thin the line was between movement and momentum. Her name badge read Ava Chen. She was 24, brilliant, overprepared, and still trying too hard not to look new. Ms. Kate Ava said, lowering her voice. Dr. Heller wants the updated vitals on Bay 2, and there is a family in room 6 asking for a timeline. And I think lab just called, but I missed part of it because the printer jammed. Lauren pulled one chart gently from the top of the stack before Ava dropped all 3. Breathe. Ava did a little. Bay 2 first, Lauren said. Family in room 6 can wait 3 minutes. If lab calls again, let it ring once before you answer. It makes you sound less panicked. Ava blinked. Really? No, but it gives you 1 second to think. Ava laughed in spite of herself. Lauren handed back the chart. You are doing fine. Slow is smooth. Ava nodded. Smooth is fast. Lauren gave the smallest hint of approval. There you go. As Ava hurried off, Micah watched the exchange and said quietly, "She has some edge to her." Walker followed his gaze. Lauren was already looking at something else, the interaction over attention, shifting seamlessly to the next problem. She has good composure, he said. That is not the same thing. Ben did not answer. He was watching Lauren place a pen back on the desk exactly parallel to the edge. The afternoon moved on. A corpsman wheeled a tray of supplies down the hall. A lieutenant commander in scrubs came out of one treatment room and disappeared into another. The television mounted in the waiting room corner played a muted news channel no one was really watching. Every few minutes, the automatic doors at the front entrance sighed open and closed, carrying in the smell of hot pavement and river air before sealing it out again. Lauren moved through it all with the same measured rhythm. She updated charts, checked an IV line, redirected a confused family member. Not once did she waste a step. Not once did she drift. And little things kept happening that did not fit the image the SEALs had built of her. A supply cart near the nurse's station rolled half an inch because one wheel had not been locked. Lauren caught it with the back of her leg without ever looking down. A monitor in Bay 4 gave a small irregular beep, and she turned before anyone else noticed, checked the lead placement, and corrected the issue before the assigned nurse had even crossed the threshold. When a Marine spouse started crying quietly by the vending machines, Lauren did not hover or offer the wrong words. She simply brought her water, sat beside her for 30 seconds, and stayed silent until the woman could breathe again. There was nothing theatrical about any of it. That was the problem. The room registered her competence the way it registered stable oxygen or working lights as part of the environment, not as something worth admiring until it was gone. Walker stretched his legs and winced when dried skin pulled at the cut across his knuckles. You ever notice, he said, how everyone in a hospital either walks too fast or too slow? Dylan smirked. I notice you talk when you are trying not to think about stitches. I am not thinking about stitches. You are definitely thinking about stitches. Micah tipped his head toward the triage desk. Ask the new nurse to hold your hand. Walker looked over at Lauren, who was checking the seal on a sterile dressing pack. She does not look like a hand-holding type. No, Ben said. She looks like the kind that tells you to stop complaining. Micah laughed. Now I definitely like her. Walker stood long enough to stretch his back, then sat again. I'm not complaining. I'm making observations. Your observations, Dylan said, keep sounding suspiciously like whining. Walker ignored him. His gaze drifted back to Lauren. She had turned toward the main corridor for no visible reason, then turned back just as quickly. It was a small movement, easy to dismiss, but it had no idle quality to it. She looked the way men looked when they heard something distant and filed it as potentially relevant without wanting to alarm anyone else. He watched her for another second, then let it go. At the desk, Lauren scanned the waiting room without appearing to. One look at the front entrance. One at the oxygen tank secured near the trauma bay wall. One at the angle of the medication cart by Bay 2. One at Mr. Donnelly, whose breathing remained just shallow enough to keep her attention. She checked the service hallway exit behind the nurse's station in the reflection of the glass. Her pulse never changed. People often mistook vigilance for anxiety when it lived in a woman's body. They saw stillness and thought it meant uncertainty. They saw restraint and thought it meant inexperience. Lauren had learned long ago that correcting those assumptions wasted energy. Competence did not require witnesses. Ava came back with fresh vitals, more composed now. Bay 2 is stable. Room 6 wants to know if the physician is coming. He is, Lauren said. Tell them he is with another patient and you will update them in 10. Ava nodded. Got it. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Do the guys in the waiting area know you can hear everything they say? Lauren signed a chart. Probably not. Ava looked offended on her behalf. They are kind of awful. Lauren slid the chart aside. No. They are tired, overconfident, and used to being the sharpest tool in the box. That is different. Ava frowned. You make that sound generous. Lauren finally looked at her. It is accurate. Ava studied her face, maybe hoping for irritation, maybe trying to understand how someone stayed this calm. You do not care what they think. Lauren took a packet of alcohol wipes from the drawer and placed it beside a thermometer. Their opinion has no effect on my pulse. Ava let out a short laugh. I want that on a mug. Lauren almost smiled. Then survive residency first. Mr. Donnelly coughed from his wheelchair, the dry, painful kind that folded his shoulders inward. Lauren moved toward him immediately. Any dizziness? A little. Chest pressure? Not exactly. She checked his pulse with 2 fingers, then his oxygen again. I'm getting you inside sooner. He studied her while she adjusted the blanket over his knees. You always this serious? Only during my cheerful hours. That earned him a real smile, brief but visible. I served with men who talked like that. Lauren tucked the blanket edge into place. Then you know it usually means I'm trying to be nice. She turned the chair slightly, just enough to improve his access if they had to move fast. A small detail. Invisible to almost everyone. Ben noticed that too. By 1:15, the waiting room had thinned by 3 patients. The floor near the entrance had been mopped and dried. The news channel on the television changed to weather maps tracking storms far out at sea. The air conditioning kicked harder, pushing a chill through the front half of the ER. From down the hall came the faint rumble of a gurney being rolled over a seam in the floor. Lauren stood at the medication counter preparing a fresh tray, counting syringes by touch as much as sight. She listened, the way other people breathed without effort, her awareness spread thin and wide over the room. Every hospital had a rhythm, and once you knew it well enough, the wrong sound stood out like a crack in glass. At first, it was nothing. So small, another person might not even have named it. A pause where there should have been movement. Then a hard impact, distant muffled from beyond the double doors leading to the main corridor. Not dropped equipment. Not a cart clipping a wall. Weight. Human weight. Lauren's fingers stopped over the tray for less than a second. She listened. The room continued around her. Walker said something under his breath that made Micah laugh. Ava was asking a physician whether room 6 could have an update. Mr. Donnelly shifted in his wheelchair and winced. An automatic blood pressure cuff hissed softly from Bay 1. Then came another sound. Footsteps. Fast but wrong. Not the clean, quick cadence of a nurse responding to a call light. Not the measured urgency of security. These were heavy off balance, striking hard through the heels as if the body making them was moving faster than it could control. There was panic in the pattern. Disorder. A person running without choosing where to place his feet. Lauren lifted her head. Across the room, nobody else reacted yet. She looked at the double doors, then at the oxygen line near Bay 2, then at the supply cart, half a yard too close to the center path, then at Mr. Donnelly in the wheelchair, and Ava standing almost directly in line with the corridor. Her mind made the adjustments instantly quiet and cold. Her hand came to rest on the edge of the counter. Ben Mercer saw that and straightened a little in his chair. Walker was still speaking when Lauren took one step out from behind the desk and turned toward the doors just as the rhythm of the room shifted under a sound that did not belong there. The rhythm of the room shifted under a sound that did not belong there. Lauren did not turn sharply. Sharp movement spread attention, and attention had weight. In a hospital, weight moved people before reason did. She lifted her eyes toward the double doors at the end of the main corridor and listened with the kind of stillness that was almost invisible unless you had spent years around people trained to survive bad moments. 1 breath. 2. The footsteps came again, harder this time, striking heel first, uneven and fast. Ben Mercer leaned forward before he knew why. Walker was still talking when he noticed Lauren had gone motionless. "You hear that?" Ben asked. Walker stopped mid-sentence. "Hear what?" Lauren had already started to move, not fast enough to alarm anyone. Just one step out from behind the desk. Her gaze flicked once across the waiting area and landed on Mr. Donnelly in the wheelchair. Too exposed. Too close to the center of the room. She shifted to Ava Chen next. The young intern was standing with 3 charts tucked to her chest, halfway turned toward Bay 2, exactly in the path someone charging through the corridor would take if they came through the doors without slowing down. Lauren spoke without raising her voice. "Ava." The intern looked up immediately, moved to the left side of the desk. Ava blinked. Why? Now. There was no panic in the order. That was why Ava obeyed. She stepped around the corner of the desk with the chart still pressed against her chest, cheeks flushing a little as if she felt silly for reacting to something she did not understand. Lauren was already reaching for the handle of Mr. Donnelly's wheelchair. "Mr. Donnelly, I need to shift you a little." He looked up at her, winded and confused. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sir." She moved his chair 6 feet back and angled it so the large wheel would not catch if someone had to pull him clear in a hurry. The adjustment was small enough that Walker only half noticed it. Ben noticed the angle. He noticed that Lauren had turned the chair so Mr. Donnelly could see the room without being exposed to its center line. The habit behind that movement was not ordinary hospital instinct. It had something colder under it. Walker stood. The plastic chair legs scraped over tile. Micah looked up at him, then toward the doors. "You got a look on your face," Micah said. Walker's head tilted, listening now. Somebody is moving fast. Dylan pushed to his feet more slowly, broad shoulders rolling once. Could just be a patient. Could be, Walker said. Lauren was not answering any of them. Her attention had narrowed, but only on the surface. Under that narrow focus, her awareness spread wider than ever. She took in the medicine cart near Bay 2. One wheel unlocked. Bad placement. The oxygen tanks chained against the wall. Safe if they stayed upright. Dangerous if a body hit them hard enough. The crash cart behind the nurse's station. Too heavy to tip easily. The glass panel beside the entrance. A reflection there gave her a partial view of the hallway before anything reached the threshold. Another impact came from beyond the double doors. Metal struck something hollow. A cart, perhaps, or a handrail. Ava's voice dropped. "Should I call security?" Lauren did not answer right away. She was counting the spacing between footfalls. Fast. Erratic. Heavy enough to suggest a man. Not staff. Not a patient escort. Not anybody in control of their balance. "Get your phone," Lauren said. "Do not call yet, just have it." Ava swallowed and nodded. Walker took 2 steps toward the center of the waiting room posture, changing with each one. The relaxed shape left him. His shoulders settled, chin lowered a fraction. Hands free and ready. The room had not become dangerous yet, but it had become possible. That was enough. Dylan and Micah spread almost without speaking muscle memory doing its quiet work. Ben moved just enough to clear the aisle and get a clean view of the doors. Lauren noticed all 3 of them reposition. Useful, also potentially catastrophic if they trusted force before context. A family in the far corner kept talking softly over a crying toddler unaware of anything. A corpsman came out of Bay 1, reading a lab sheet, glanced up, sensed tension, and slowed. Mr. Donnelly looked from face to face, old instincts stirring behind age and pain. The overhead television shifted from weather maps to a commercial no one heard. The footsteps stopped. That was worse. For half a heartbeat there was nothing at all. No movement beyond the doors. No sound except the hum of lights, the whisper of air through vents, the soft electronic pulse of a monitor behind a curtain. Lauren felt the silence like pressure against her skin. She had known silences like that in very different places, where mountains held their breath and wind dropped flat across dry rock, and a whole valley seemed to pause before deciding whether to kill someone. People who had never been there believed danger announced itself. In truth, danger often arrived after the world had gone, briefly, unnaturally still. Walker glanced at her. "You know something?" Lauren kept her eyes on the doors. "I know somebody out there is not moving like staff," Micah said. That all. For now. The answer irritated Walker for reasons he could not have explained. Maybe because it sounded too controlled. Maybe because a nurse standing in Navy scrubs should not have been the most composed person in the room once his own instincts had started to rise. He took another step forward. The doors exploded inward. Not opened, not pushed, kicked. Both panels slammed wide with a violent crack that echoed off the walls. One hit the stopper so hard it bounced back halfway before jerking open again. A man stumbled through the gap with enough speed to almost fall, caught himself on the edge of a rolling stand and sent it skidding sideways into a supply bin. Plastic trays crashed to the floor. Cotton wraps spilled loose. The sound hit the room like a starter pistol. The man looked to be in his mid-30s, maybe older. Hard to tell through the damage panic did to a face. He wore hospital sweats and a white patient wristband that had half torn loose and was hanging from one arm. His hair was soaked dark with sweat. His eyes were huge, unfocused, darting from ceiling to floor to the nearest human shape without recognition settling on any of it. He was breathing through his mouth in short, raw bursts, chest pumping as if he had been running for miles or drowning for hours. One side of his shirt was twisted up near the shoulder like somebody had grabbed him and he had ripped free. He shouted something, but it landed in pieces. "Down, get down, no, move." The words came out shredded by terror. He hit the metal medication cart near the center path with both hands and shoved it so hard it spun on one wheel and toppled. Glass vials burst across tile. A stainless tray rang against the floor. Ava gasped and backed into the desk. The corpsman with the lab sheet froze. The family in the corner jerked upright, the toddler starting to wail. Mr. Donnelly tried to wheel himself backward, but one hand slipped on the rim and the chair snagged against the edge of the wall. Walker moved immediately. "Sir, stop right there." His voice came out hard, command first, question never. The man whipped toward the sound. For a split second his face was wide open to the room, and Lauren saw what the others did not. Not drunkenness, not calculated aggression. Terror so severe it had blown his reasoning apart. His pupils were enlarged almost to the edge of the iris. His shoulders were locked high with panic. His hands opened and closed, not like fists preparing to strike, but like hands trying to grab hold of a world that had shifted under them. He was not choosing targets. He was trying to survive something no one else could see. Walker took one more step in setting his weight. That almost did it. The man lunged sideways and ripped a portable patient monitor off a rolling stand. Cords tore free with a shower of sharp plastic snaps. The machine hung in both his hands, heavy and awkward, but he lifted it as if adrenaline had cut 10 pounds off its weight. Micah swore under his breath. Dylan moved right to take the flank. Ben's gaze snapped to Mr. Donnelly, and then to the oxygen tanks, calculating fallout before impact. The room tightened around one terrible possibility. If Walker tackled the man now, they would go down in a spray of cords and broken glass. The monitor could smash against a patient. The man could strike out blindly with it. Somebody could hit the oxygen line. Somebody could crack a skull on tile. The crying toddler in the corner went higher, shriller. Ava whispered, "Oh God." Walker lowered further, ready to drive in. Then Lauren stepped into the open. "Nobody touches him." She did not shout, she cut. The words snapped across the room with such clean authority that even Walker stopped half a beat before he understood why. Lauren moved past the toppled cart and came to a halt 7 feet from the man holding the monitor. Not 6, not 8. Far enough to stay outside the most chaotic range of a swing. Close enough to keep his attention from breaking loose and bouncing around the room. Her hands stayed open at her sides. Her shoulders were low. Her face gave him nothing to feed on. The man jerked toward her monitor, lifted. Lauren's voice stayed level. "Ava, get the family behind the desk." Ava moved at once, ushering the mother and child toward cover with a trembling hand. Ben moved Mr. Donnelly out of center, slow. Ben did not pause to ask how she knew his name. He crossed to the wheelchair, speaking calmly to the old veteran, even as his eyes stayed on the man with the monitor. "Sir, I've got you." Mr. Donnelly, pale and breathing hard, managed a curt nod as Ben pulled the chair backward and angled it behind the line of the desk. "Micah," Lauren said, still not taking her eyes off the man. "Kill that oxygen line by Bay 2. Micah hesitated for less than a second, then moved. Walker looked at Lauren, disbelief and annoyance colliding in his face. "We need to put him down." "No." Her answer was immediate. "You need to stay left and 3 feet back." The man holding the monitor made a choking sound that might once have been a curse. His gaze skittered over Walker, over the crying child, over the ceiling lights, then back to Lauren because she was the only thing in the room that was not moving unpredictably. Walker stared at her. "You giving me orders?" Lauren never looked at him, yes. Dylan shifted farther right, ready to close if it turned physical despite her. "Lauren." She answered him without breaking eye contact with the man. "Guard the angle. Do not crowd." The authority in her voice was not improvised. It was not borrowed from hospital rank or manufactured for effect. It came from somewhere much older and far less negotiable. In another setting, with another uniform and a rifle slung across her chest, nobody would have questioned it for a second. Here, inside bright lights and sterile walls, it felt almost unreal. The man's breathing rasped louder. Sweat ran down his temples and disappeared into the collar of his shirt. He shifted his grip on the monitor, one elbow trembling from strain. Lauren watched the movement with absolute concentration. She did not study the object. She studied the body attached to it. The shoulder was overloaded, the right wrist lacked control. Weight too far back on the heels. No organized intent. No fixed target. He could hurt someone badly. He might not even understand he was doing it. "Look at me," she said. He shouted over her words, jagged and broken. "Incoming. Move." They left him there. They left him there. The room around Lauren disappeared, or rather moved to the edges where she could still track it without letting it pull her focus. She had heard men speak from inside old explosions before. Heard time and place tear loose under them. The wrong response was to contradict their reality head-on. The wrong response was to bark harder, move faster, challenge the hallucination like it was a lie. A body trapped inside panic obeyed force only until it snapped. Her voice dropped lower. "You are in Portsmouth. You are inside a hospital." He shook his head violently. spittle catching at the corner of his mouth. No. Yes. Not an argument. A fact offered without strain. Tile floor, fluorescent lights, medical bay, you see me. His eyes locked on hers for one wavering second. There you go, Lauren said. Walker felt the strange weight of the moment settle over him. The nurse he had written off half an hour ago was standing in front of a volatile stranger with no visible fear in her face, pulling the entire room into alignment around her without ever raising her voice above command volume. He had seen men dominate spaces with rank. He had seen others do it with violence. This was neither. This was control built on precision so fine it felt almost invisible unless you were close enough to get cut by it. The man's gaze slipped away and caught on a reflection in the glass panel near the entrance. He flinched as if he had seen someone there. The monitor rose another inch. Lauren shifted half a step to her right. It was a tiny movement, but it forced him to turn with her if he wanted to keep sight of the one stable point in the room. As he turned, the face of the monitor and the likely arc of its movement rotated away from the family and farther from Mr. Donnelly. Walker saw it happen and realized she had just redirected danger with less effort than it would have taken him to lunge. Easy, Lauren said. Keep looking at me. Security had not arrived. No alarm sounded yet. A physician poked his head out of Bay 4, saw the scene, and vanished back inside, probably reaching for a phone. The toddler had gone from screaming to hiccuping sobs. Ava stood behind the desk with one hand pressed over her mouth, the other gripping the mother's shoulder. Ben remained beside Mr. Donnelly, one arm on the wheelchair handle, the other slightly raised, ready to move the old man again if needed. Micah returned from the oxygen line and stopped at the edge of Lauren's peripheral field. "It's off," he said quietly. Lauren gave the smallest nod. The man's hands shook harder. His grip was going. So was his anger, if anger had ever been the right word. There was more fear in him than force now. The monitor dipped and rose again in an ugly, uncertain arc. He was tiring out, which made him more dangerous in the narrowest sense and less dangerous in the broader one. Fatigue broke panic open. Once it opened, the body either surrendered or lashed out one last time. "Tell me your name," Lauren said. He stared at her as if the question came from underwater. His lips moved. No sound came out. "That is fine," she said. "You do not need your name yet. You need one order." His chest hitched. Walker could see the man trying to process her words through whatever nightmare had hold of him. The monitor sagged in his hands, then jerked up again as some internal image changed. Dylan muttered under his breath. "He's about to drop it or throw it." Lauren heard him and did not answer. She kept her eyes soft and her posture hard. "Set it down." The man's breathing hitched once, twice. He looked at the machine in his hands as if he had only just discovered it there. "Set it down," Lauren repeated. His mouth worked around a broken sentence, couldn't get to him. The words landed in the room with enough pain behind them to make even Walker hesitate. Lauren did not lean into sympathy. She did not let pity open the perimeter. She answered pain with steadiness. "You are here now," she said. "Set it down." His fingers shifted. Lauren saw the decision before anybody else. It was in the shoulder first, then in the wrist, then in the way the elbows lost their locked strain and started to fold. The change was tiny, but it was there. Her own body stayed absolutely still, giving him nothing new to react to. "That's it," she said, voice almost gentle now, slow. The monitor lowered an inch, then another. The room breathed with him whether it wanted to or not. Walker kept his weight loaded, ready for a rush if the surrender turned false. Micah held position near Bay 2. Dylan watched the man's hands. Ben kept his arm tight behind Mr. Donnelly's chair. Ava did not move at all. The monitor touched tile with a dull, heavy thud. No shattering glass, no wild swing, just dead weight returning to the floor. The man stared at it. Then something in him collapsed. His knees folded underneath him. He dropped so suddenly, Lauren took one quick step forward before stopping herself. He hit the floor hard and covered his face with both hands. The sound that came out of him next was not rage, and not threat. It was grief stripped raw, the kind that made a whole room feel ashamed of its own silence. Only then did the siren at the far end of the corridor start to wail. Lauren exhaled once through her nose. Walker realized, almost with embarrassment, that his heart was pounding harder than hers looked to be. He stayed where he was because motion still mattered, but the immediate strike had gone out of the room. The danger had not disappeared. It had broken open into something else, something medical, something human. Lauren lowered herself just enough to reduce her height without kneeling in shattered glass. "Hands where I can see them." The man obeyed after a second, dragging his palms away from his face. Tears and sweat had mixed into a slick shine across his cheeks. "Good," Lauren said. "Stay right there." His eyes flicked to her again now, less wild, more lost. The first two members of hospital security appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast and hard with the zip restraints ready. Behind them came a physician and another nurse. The room flooded with aftermath energy. Questions, orders, shoes slapping tile, somebody calling for psych support, somebody else asking if anyone was injured. Lauren raised one hand without turning around. "Slow your approach," she said. Security checked itself almost visibly. One of the officers, older and more seasoned, read the scene in a glance and nodded. They came in measured, not charging. One went left, one right. The physician moved toward the desk to assess the family and the intern. The other nurse stepped toward the broken glass and stopped when she saw how much of it there was. The man on the floor had begun to shake all over every muscle in his back, quivering with the collapse after panic. Lauren finally lowered to one knee, careful where she placed it. "Can you hear me?" He nodded once, barely. "Good. Keep breathing." His breath stuttered anyway. "Look at my hand." She held up 2 fingers. His eyes found them with effort. "There you go. Stay with that." Security moved in another foot. The older officer glanced at Lauren. "You want soft restraints?" "Yes," she said. "No hard contact unless he surges." The officer nodded and signaled his partner. Walker stared at her again. No hesitation, no confusion, no need to ask permission from the loudest man in the room. Just judgment, clean and immediate. The physician crouched on the far side of the desk to speak with Ava, who nodded too fast at whatever he asked. Ben finally eased his grip on Mr. Donnelly's wheelchair, though he did not let go completely. Micah let out a breath he had been holding long enough to make his shoulders ache. Dylan rubbed one hand across his mouth and looked at the dropped monitor on the floor, like he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about force. Lauren kept speaking to the man, steady and quiet, giving him one simple direction at a time, while security prepared to secure him safely for transfer. Her tone had changed again. Not softer exactly, more clinical. Less edge, more care. The transition was seamless enough to be unsettling. When the officer beside her reached for the man's wrist, Lauren said, "Tell him before you touch him." The officer did. "I'm taking your left arm now." The man flinched but did not fight. The restraint went on clean. Walker took one step back for the first time since the doors had flown open. His gaze found Lauren and held there. The nurse, who had spent the last 40 minutes quietly sorting charts and checking IV lines, had just controlled a live crisis in a crowded military emergency room with the kind of command presence he associated with raid briefs, rooftop overwatch, and men whose voices came through radios in places where mistakes did not get repeated. And she had done it in scrubs. Around them, the room began the slow process of becoming a hospital again. The family in the corner was being guided to another area. Ava was answering questions in a voice that still shook. A corpsman was gathering unbroken supplies from the floor. One of the physicians asked for incident documentation. Someone killed the television at last, plunging that corner into welcome silence. Mr. Donnelly sat very still in his wheelchair, eyes fixed on Lauren with the expression of a man who had just watched one profession peel back and reveal another underneath it. Lauren rose-checked the line of the room once more, and only then took her eyes off the man. The fluorescent lights still hummed. The air still smelled like antiseptic and coffee, and heat carried in on uniforms. But nothing in that room felt ordinary anymore, and Lauren Cade was still standing in the center of it, steady as stone, while the last of the shattered glass caught the overhead light at her feet. Nobody in the room seemed ready to speak above a murmur. The sound level dropped first. That was how the body understood a crisis had changed shape. A few moments earlier, the ER had been full of collision and command and the hard edge of fear. Now the noise fell into fragments. The crackle of a handheld radio on a security officer's shoulder. The hush of a mop being pulled from a janitor's closet down the hall. The wet catch in the breath of the man on the floor, as soft restraints were secured around his wrists. The small, ragged cries of the toddler in the waiting area fading into hiccups against her mother's shoulder. Lauren stood still in the middle of it long enough to make sure nothing in the room was about to go wrong in a new direction. Her gaze moved in a precise, quiet pattern. Family safe. Oxygen line off. Security in control, but not escalating. Mr. Donnelly stable for the moment. Ava upright shaken, not dissociating. No one bleeding badly. No glass in the child's shoes. No one slipping into the dangerous confusion that follows adrenaline when people begin moving too fast after the fact. Only when all of that settled into place did Lauren let herself exhale. It was small, barely visible, but Walker saw it. He had watched men in close quarters after firefights, after boarding actions, after night insertions that had gone loud too soon. He knew what it looked like when a body came down from survival mode, but refused to surrender control until the edges were secure. Lauren's exhale was that kind of exhale, not relief. Confirmation. The older security officer finished giving instructions to his partner, then looked at Lauren with the open respect of someone who had recognized professional competence when he saw it. "You knew he was going to break," he said. Lauren crouched beside the patient, checking the tension in the restraint and the position of his shoulder. "I knew pressure was building faster than aggression. That is not the same thing. Number." The officer nodded once, storing that away. "Psych is on the way." Lauren touched 2 fingers lightly to the man's wrist and counted under her breath. "Good." The patient's eyes flicked upward, embarrassed now in a way that hurt to look at. The panic had not vanished, but the total possession of it had loosened. In its place came fragments of awareness, enough to feel trapped, enough to feel watched, enough to feel whatever shame remained when a mind came back and found the damage it had done. "You with me?" Lauren asked. He swallowed hard. "I did not mean to." His voice cracked and fell apart. "I know," she said. "You cannot know." The answer came weak and angry at the same time, the kind of anger pain borrowed when it no longer had the strength to stand on its own. Lauren did not react to the tone. "Your breathing is slowing. That is what I need right now." He shut his eyes. One of the physicians approached, careful with his steps. Commander Seth Heller, trauma attending, mid-40s, sharp-featured, and usually too brisk to hide what he thought. At the moment, his expression held a thin layer of irritation over genuine concern. Not aimed at Lauren, aimed at the room, at the broken equipment, at the fact that one bad moment could turn an emergency department into a weapon against itself. Lauren. She looked up. "Any impact injuries?" "None that I saw." He was swinging erratic, not targeting. He may have strained his shoulder lifting the monitor. Heller glanced at the patient, then at the monitor on the floor, then at the SEALs who had not yet fully resumed breathing like ordinary men. "You got all that from 10 feet away." 7. Heller stared at her for half a second. "Of course you did." He crouched on the opposite side of the patient, doing his own quick assessment, but his eyes kept drifting back to the room, as though reconstructing the geometry of what had just happened. "You want him sedated? Only if Psych agrees he is spiraling again. He is orienting. Fast restraint is enough for the moment." Heller nodded, because he trusted her judgment in the department, and because what he had just witnessed had burned through the normal hierarchy people placed around nursing. Lauren had not overridden the room. She had prevented the room from breaking. He glanced toward Ava, who was now sitting behind the desk on a rolling stool, shoulders tight, hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she had not yet managed to drink. "Chen, all right." Lauren followed his line of sight. "Shaken, functional. I'll have someone sit with her. She needs a task more than she needs pity." Heller almost smiled. "You giving orders all the way up the chain now? I am making observations. That apparently is what we all ought to be doing." He rose and moved toward Ava. Walker heard that exchange and felt something settle heavily in his chest. This was not a fluke. Not a lucky read, not one moment of nerve in a woman who had happened to keep her head when others lost theirs. The attending physician had taken her assessment without argument. The security officer had deferred to her perimeter. The corpsmen were looking at her the way enlisted men looked at someone whose authority came from competence rather than paperwork. Walker had misread her in a way that now felt almost insulting to himself. Micah had come to the same realization. He stood near Bay 2 with one hand on his hip and the other braced against the wall, staring at Lauren as if he was trying to fit two incompatible truths into the same frame. Dylan broke the silence first. "Chief." Walker looked at him. Dylan did not lower his voice enough. "Who the hell is she?" Ben answered before Walker could. "Not what we thought." Nobody smiled at that. Lauren rose from her crouch and spoke quietly to the security officer handling the patient's left side. "He is starting to shiver. Get a blanket once psych clears transport." The officer nodded. Then Lauren turned and crossed the room toward the sink by the nurse's station. Every pair of eyes followed her. She passed the broken cart without looking down at it, stepped over a line of glass fragments, and reached the sink in 6 clean motions that betrayed no excess adrenaline at all. She turned the faucet on and held her hands under the stream, letting water and soap strip away the sweat that had settled in the lines of her fingers. A thin piece of label adhesive clung to one knuckle where she must have brushed the torn wristband. She peeled it away and dropped it into the trash. The gesture was so ordinary, it made the rest of what had happened feel unreal. Walker started toward her. He was not sure whether he meant to thank her, challenge her, or just confirm that the person he had seen in the center of the room a minute earlier was the same person now. Washing her hands like this was one more task in a long shift. When he reached the sink, Lauren was already drying her hands on a paper towel, head slightly bowed, attention half on the room reflected in the stainless backsplash. That was not nursing school, Walker said. She folded the towel once before tossing it. No, up close, the steadiness in her face was even stranger. No triumph, no visible adrenaline tremor, no sharpened edge of a person waiting for praise and trying not to look like it. Just a quiet return to baseline. Walker kept his own voice low. "You called angles. You controlled the spacing. You moved to civilians before anyone else even understood the room had gone bad." Lauren reached for a fresh pair of gloves, then reconsidered and left them where they were. "That was the room going bad," she said. "It happens." Micah walked over, then Dylan, then Ben. For the first time since they had entered the ER, the 4 SEALs stood in a loose line without owning the center of the space. They did not crowd her. Something in all of them understood that crowding would be the wrong move. Dylan glanced toward the patient now being assessed by psych staff at the far end of the corridor. "You knew he was not going to attack." Lauren looked at him. "I knew he was not trying to hunt anybody. That is a fine distinction when someone has a monitor over his head. It is the only distinction that mattered." Ben leaned one shoulder lightly against the wall, arms relaxed, but eyes fixed on her. "How?" Lauren turned the faucet off completely. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence, less about fear, more about waiting to see whether a door was about to open. She answered the question the way she seemed to answer everything, with no decoration. Hands, eyes, breathing, weight on the heels. No target lock. Panic has a shape. Micah let out a short breath through his nose. "You saying you read all that in one look?" "I read it in 3. Walker heard the answer and felt his own pulse kick once in something close to disbelief. That level of assessment under pressure was not normal. It was cultivated, burned in. He said the thing sitting heaviest in his mind. You military before this. Lauren held his gaze for the first time since the crisis had started. Yes, the word hung there. Dylan straightened a little. Ortman. Number. Ben asked it softly, almost as if he already knew the answer would rearrange the room again. What were you? Lauren's expression did not change, but something old and distant touched her eyes the way weather touches glass without entering the room. United States Marine Corps, she said. Infantry. Micah blinked. Dylan looked from her face to her hands and back again. Walker stayed perfectly still. Lauren continued because all four of them were waiting. Scout Sniper Platoon, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. The sentence landed like dropped steel. For a heartbeat, nobody said anything at all. The overhead lights hummed. A nurse pushed a linen cart past the far doorway. Somewhere in another wing, a phone rang and rang before someone picked it up. The world moved on, but not in that patch of floor beside the sink. Walker felt heat rise at the back of his neck, not from embarrassment alone, though there was plenty of that. It was the hard, clean shock of realizing he had spent the better part of an afternoon making lazy assumptions about a woman who had stood in places he respected too much to talk lightly about. Micah spoke first, all sarcasm stripped out of his voice. You were a sniper. Lauren did not nod like someone claiming a title. She nodded like someone acknowledging a weather report. Yes. Dylan rubbed his thumb along the line of his jaw. In combat. Yes. Ben asked, how long? 2 deployments. Where? Helmand. That one word changed the temperature again. Walker had never served there, but he knew enough. Enough to fill the blank space around the answer with hard country, hard fights, and the kind of patience that did not belong to ordinary people. He looked at Lauren more carefully now, as if the right details had only just come into focus. The stillness, the exactness, the way she had not once raised her voice above what the room needed, the way she had seen a collapse of the nervous system where he had first seen a target. He heard his own earlier remarks in memory and wished he could drag them back out of the air. Micah shook his head once, a small, involuntary motion of disbelief. You just work triage and say nothing about any of that. Lauren turned away from the sink and picked up the tablet she had left on the counter before the doors blew open. The screen had gone dark. She tapped it awake and checked the chart still open from before the crisis. I work emergency medicine, she said. That is the relevant part in this building. Walker stared at her. That is not all that is relevant. It was relevant 10 minutes ago. He had no answer for that. Ava stood up from the stool behind the desk, still pale but steadier now, and crossed toward them carrying the paper cup in both hands. She stopped near Lauren and looked at the seals as if only just realizing they were all standing there because of her. You never said any of that, Ava said. Lauren glanced at her. You never asked. Ava gave a weak laugh. That is not fair. It is also true. Heller returned from speaking with psych intake and paused near the desk chart in hand. His gaze moved from Lauren to the 4 operators around her, and he seemed to understand the shape of the conversation without hearing a word of it. Well, he said dryly, now the whole floor is going to find out by dinner. Lauren's mouth flattened a fraction. I would prefer they did not. Heller looked around at the broken monitor, the toppled cart, the security reports being written, and the 4 visibly humbled SEALs standing like chastened schoolboys near the sink. That ship, he said, is no longer in port. For the first time since Walker had laid eyes on her, a real expression crossed Lauren's face. Not amusement exactly. More resignation with a trace of humor buried under it. It vanished almost immediately. Heller handed the tablet back to Ava. Miss Chen, update room 6. Tell them I am coming in 4 minutes. Ava straightened. Yes, sir. And get yourself another cup of water. Yes, sir. She hurried off, grateful to be moving again. Walker looked from Heller back to Lauren. He knew my service record. You really keep this buried. Lauren turned the tablet in her hands and reviewed the waiting patient list as if trying to pull the room back toward the normal by force of routine. I am not burying anything. I changed jobs. Ben watched her carefully. Most people would mention it. Lauren gave him a look that was not unkind. Most people enjoy talking about themselves. That ended the thought in Ben's mouth. Across the room, Mr. Donnelly was still seated behind the desk line where Ben had moved him. He lifted one hand slightly to get Lauren's attention. She saw him at once and crossed the floor before any of the others could think to step aside. "You all right, Mr. Donnelly?" He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Lauren checked his color, then his breathing, then the pulse oximeter clipped to his finger. "I am asking first. I have had worse afternoons. I would like to prevent a repeat performance." His old eyes rested on her face for a long moment, marine. Lauren answered without hesitation, "Yes, sir." He nodded, as if that explained something he had already guessed. "I knew a few. That is dangerous." "It is accurate." He looked past her toward the seals, then back again. "You handled yourself. So did you." He snorted softly. "I was trying not to get run over. You succeeded, because that young man got me clear." He nodded toward Ben, who dipped his head in acknowledgement. Lauren adjusted the blanket over Mr. Donnelly's knees. "Then I am grateful he listened." Walker heard the line from where he stood and felt the sting of it more than he probably should have. He had listened too eventually, but only after his instincts had collided with hers. Ben, for all his quiet, had recognized faster that Lauren's command was grounded in something real. Walker filed that away for later. Psych staff began moving the patient down the hall slower now, the crisis reduced from public emergency to private wreckage. As he passed the nurse's station, the man turned his head once toward Lauren. His face had drained of color. He looked hollowed out as though the panic had burned through him and left only ash. Lauren met his eyes. "You did the hard part," she told him. He swallowed shame and gratitude fighting across his face. Then he was guided onward and out of sight. The moment he disappeared, motion returned to the ER in earnest. A janitor arrived with a wide broom and heavy dustpan. The broken monitor was lifted away. Fresh supplies were brought to replace the ones scattered across the floor. Family members whispered in corners, reconstructing what they thought they had seen. A lieutenant from administration appeared with a clipped expression and the instinctive hunger of someone already thinking in incident reports. Heller intercepted him before he reached Lauren and steered him toward the physician station. Walker watched that too. Heller was protecting her from bureaucratic nonsense until the room stabilized. Another sign. Another confirmation that in this department, Lauren occupied a place that had been earned, not granted. Micah shook his head and muttered mostly to himself, "We really did not know who we were looking at." "No," Dylan said quietly, "we did not." Lauren moved back behind the triage desk and began reopening charts. It was almost offensive how quickly she returned to work. She signed off on one medication order, flagged Mr. Donnelly's oxygen saturation for repeat assessment, and checked the intake queue for the next arrival, as if the last 15 minutes belonged to some other shift. Walker stepped closer to the desk. "Lauren." She looked up. He was not sure when he had stopped thinking of her as Nurse Cade and started using her first name in his head, but it had happened. "I owe you an apology." Her expression did not harden, but it became unreadable in a different way. For what part? The question landed clean and sharp, and Walker deserved every edge of it. "For the waiting room." He held her gaze. "For deciding I knew what kind of person you were because of what uniform you had on." Micah looked away. Dylan folded his arms. Ben stayed still, letting Walker take the hit alone. Lauren considered him for a second. Then she said, "You saw a nurse." Walker nodded. "I saw only a nurse. That is not an insult." He absorbed that, then let out a slow breath. "No, it is not." She returned her attention to the chart for a moment, typing in a note with precise movements. "You underestimated the room more than you underestimated me." He frowned slightly. "Explain that." Lauren glanced toward the corridor where the patient had disappeared. "This is not a quiet place because people are safe. It is a dangerous place because people arrive broken in ways they do not understand yet. Broken bodies, broken thinking, broken timing. In here, the fight is just wearing different clothes." The sentence settled hard in the air between them. Walker had no clever answer for it. Dylan shifted his weight. That why you came here? Lauren kept typing. I came here because this is where I wanted to work. Micah crossed his arms. That is not really an answer. Lauren looked up at him. It is the one I am giving. Ben was the only one who heard the trace of strain under her control. Not enough to call it pain. Enough to know there were doors behind that answer that she had no interest in opening on a hospital floor. Before anyone could push further, Ava reappeared from room 6. Dr. Heller says family updated, and they stopped glaring at me like I killed somebody. Lauren nodded once. Progress. Ava looked at the 4 seals and then back at Lauren as if still trying to reconcile the woman she worked beside every shift with the woman who had just taken command of a live crisis, and then admitted with no drama at all to a combat history most people would build their entire identity around. Do you ever tell stories? Ava asked. Lauren signed another line on the chart. Not at work. Ever. Lauren paused. For the first time, a silence opened around her that felt truly personal. When she answered, her voice was quiet enough that the room seemed to lean toward it. Enough people came home with less than they left with, she said. I do not need my stories to stand on them. Nobody spoke after that. Walker felt something change in the way he understood her. Respect was part of it, certainly. So was embarrassment. But there was another thing too harder to name. The abrupt recognition that his world and hers had overlapped in ways he had failed to honor. Not because she demanded honor, because she had none of the hunger for recognition that usually accompanied people with difficult histories. She had carried all of that into a hospital and turned it into service without once asking anyone to notice. Heller came back across the room, flipping through a chart as he walked. Walker. The seal straightened automatically. Sir, you still need that hand cleaned and those stitches checked. Walker glanced at the cut across his knuckles and almost laughed. It felt absurd now, standing here with a minor injury and an ego in pieces. Yes, sir. Heller jerked his head toward an exam room. Give us 10. Walker nodded. Heller looked at Lauren. You good? I am working. Which was not my question. Lauren met his eyes. Yes. Heller studied her for a second, as if making sure she meant it, then moved on. Micah tapped 2 fingers lightly against the counter. You just going to act like none of that happened? Lauren looked down at the intake queue again. No, I'm going to finish my shift. Dylan let out a slow breath that might once have turned into a joke in a different version of this afternoon. It did not now. You really are a Marine. Lauren almost smiled, formerly. Ben shook his head. I do not know about that. She returned the tablet to its stand. Then your standards are too sentimental. The line broke the tension just enough for Micah to laugh once softly, more in disbelief than humor. For the first time since the doors had blown open, the room felt capable of carrying normal conversation again. But normal did not mean unchanged. Every person in the ER now moved around Lauren a little differently. The corpsman from the medicine fridge answered her faster. Ava watched her with open admiration she had not tried to conceal. Even the administration lieutenant, once Heller finally let him get close enough to ask procedural questions, seemed careful with his tone. It was not rank they were reacting to. It was proof. Visible, undeniable proof of the kind that altered a room in real time. Walker stood there another moment, then said, I meant what I said. Lauren looked at him. The apology. She held his gaze, measuring something in him, perhaps whether he wanted forgiveness more than he wanted to mean the words. Then she nodded once. Understood. Not accepted. Not rejected. Understood. It was enough. Walker stepped back from the desk. The cut on his knuckles had begun to throb again, a small, ordinary pain in a day that no longer felt ordinary. As he turned toward the exam rooms, he caught Ben watching Lauren from across the floor, with the distant look of a man still running the footage back in his head from every angle. Dylan was doing the same, so was Micah. Lauren, meanwhile, had already moved on to Mr. Donnelly's chart, one hand resting lightly on the desk as she reviewed his oxygen numbers and prepared to bring the emergency department back into alignment, one patient at a time. Walker took 2 steps, then paused and looked over his shoulder. Lauren had shifted her attention to a fresh set of vitals, but her posture had not changed. Calm, balanced, unwasted. In the bright, cold wash of the overhead lights with antiseptic in the air, and the memory of broken glass still gleaming in the cracks between floor tiles, she looked less like someone returning from crisis than someone who had simply completed a task. Walker had met men like that before. He had just never expected one of them to be standing behind a hospital desk with a stethoscope folded neatly beside a chart. He went where Heller had directed, and the others slowly drifted after him, each man carrying his own version of the same realization, while Lauren remained at her station steady and unreadable, as if the room had not just been taught exactly who had been holding it together all along. As if the room had not just been taught exactly who had been holding it together all along. Lauren reached for Mr. Donnelly's chart and began reading the numbers that mattered more to her than anyone's newly awakened respect. The old sailor's oxygen saturation had dipped again during the disturbance. Not catastrophically, but enough to sharpen her attention. She crossed to him with the pulse oximeter sensor in one hand and a portable blood pressure cuff in the other. Mr. Donnelly lifted his chin as she approached, pride still intact beneath age and discomfort. "You look like you're about to scold me," he said. "I am deciding whether you earned one." He managed a thin smile. "I survived the excitement. You also have the breathing pattern of a man who thinks surviving one problem excuses the other." She slipped the cuff around his arm with practiced hands and started the reading. His skin felt cool. Too cool for someone whose face still carried the residue of stress. She watched the pulse line on the portable monitor settle into a rhythm that told her more than the numbers ever would. Fatigue. Pain. A little fear, not panic. He was steady enough. Mr. Donnelly looked at her while the cuff tightened. "How long were you in?" "Long enough," Lauren said. He chuckled once, then winced for it. That answer usually means longer than the person wants to talk about. It usually means I'm checking your blood pressure. He nodded, slowly accepting the boundary, because he recognized it for what it was. Men of his generation had learned to hear what was not being said, and respect it when it came wrapped in competence. The cuff released with a hiss. Lauren checked the reading, made a note in the chart, then crouched just enough to meet his eyes. "You did well." I sat still. "You sat still while the whole room lost its mind. That counts." Mr. Donnelly's gaze drifted toward the sink where Walker had stood moments earlier, then back to Lauren. The young men with the broad shoulders seem quieter now. They will recover. Will they? Probably not today. That drew a fuller smile from him, and for a second, the room around them almost felt normal. Then his expression softened in a different direction. "I knew a corpsman in Da Nang," he said. "Looked ordinary till the shooting started. Then everybody remembered his name all at once." Lauren adjusted the blanket over his knees. "Hospitals tend to reveal people at inconvenient times. You saying this was inconvenient for you?" "I am saying I preferred anonymity." He let that sit for a moment. "Never lasts." "Number." She checked his pulse again, counted the spacing between beats, and straightened. "I'm moving you into a room as soon as one clears." He nodded. "You do what you need to do." "I usually do." When she turned away, Walker was still there, just far enough back to keep from intruding close enough that he had heard part of the exchange. He shifted his weight the second her eyes found him, as if deciding whether to step in or stand down. He had lost the easy ownership he carried into the ER earlier. In its place was something more careful, more honest. Lauren stopped at the desk and signed a medication order. "You still here for a reason, Chief?" Walker let out a breath through his nose. "Depends how many reasons I'm allowed." Lauren glanced up. "One at a time works better." Micah and Dylan lingered near the exam room hallway, not pretending not to listen. Ben remained by the wall with his arms loosely folded, his attention quieter than the others but no less fixed. Ava moved between stations with a stack of fresh labels, trying very hard to look like she was not part of the same gravitational pull, drawing everyone back toward Lauren. Walker came closer to the desk, though not close enough to crowd it. He rested one hand on the edge, looked at the scabbed cut across his knuckles, as if it had become unexpectedly embarrassing, then lifted his eyes to hers. "You said I underestimated the room." Lauren returned her attention to the chart for a beat before answering. "Yes, I've been in plenty of rooms like this." "No," she said. "You've been in rooms where your job was to dominate the threat. That is not the same thing." The words did not sting because of the tone. They stung because they were exact. Walker frowned, not defensive so much as thoughtful now. "Then explain the difference to me." Lauren set the chart down. The movement drew the others closer without any of them quite meaning to step in. Heller passed through the far side of the nurse's station, recognized the shape of the moment, and kept moving. He knew when a room was teaching itself something. Lauren folded her hands loosely on the counter. "In your world," she said, "speed and force end the problem if they are applied correctly. In here, speed and force can multiply the problem before anybody realizes it. A terrified patient is not the same as a hostile target. A psychotic break is not the same as intent. A man in a hallway with trauma in his eyes can become dangerous in 1 second, but if you treat him like he arrived as an enemy, you may be the one who turns fear into violence." Micah shifted where he stood. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't." "Then how do you know the difference that fast?" Lauren looked at him. "Practice." Walker shook his head once. "That is not just practice." "No," Lauren said quietly, "it isn't." The answer opened another silence, not awkward this time, weighty, expectant. "Ben broke it. You learned that in the Marines." Lauren's expression did not change. "I learned pieces of it there. From what Dylan asked, watching people. Mostly." Micah almost laughed, but there was no mockery in it. Watching people from how far away? Lauren held his gaze for half a second. Far enough. Walker let the meaning of that settle. Then he said, "You were not just assigned to a sniper platoon. You worked as one." Lauren nodded once. "Long gun." "Yes." "Real world." "Yes." Again, the plainness of her answers made them hit harder than any dramatic retelling could have done. Ava had paused beside a supply cabinet with labels in one hand and a pen in the other, eyes moving from face to face. "I still cannot picture it," she said softly. Lauren turned just enough to include her in the room without putting her on display. "That is probably healthy." Ava gave a nervous little laugh. "No offense, but that is the least helpful answer anyone has ever given me. It is the most honest one." Walker studied Lauren's face, searching now not for proof that she was who she claimed to be, but for any sign that she wanted credit for it. He found none. That unsettled him more than if she had played to it. Men who had done hard things often wore those things like medals, even when no actual medal had been pinned to the memory. Lauren wore her past like scar tissue beneath a uniform sleeve. Present. Forming everything. Never volunteered. "You said 2 deployments," he said. "Yes." "Both Helmand." "Yes." "Where exactly?" Lauren's eyes flicked toward him. The question was respectful, but it came from a place deeper than curiosity. Anyone who had worked inside the military long enough knew geography could function as confession. Certain place names carried enough blood inside them to change a conversation. "Sangan," once she said. "Upper Gereshk once." Ben lowered his eyes for a moment. Even Micah's face tightened. Walker felt the answer land somewhere below the ribs. He nodded slowly. That would do it. Lauren gave no reaction to the phrase. No agreement, no correction. She just reached for a fresh pen and wrote an order at the bottom of Mr. Donnelly's chart. Dylan looked down the hallway as if those names had shifted some private map in his head. "And now you work triage and trauma," Lauren said. "And whatever else walks through the door." Micah leaned a shoulder against the counter. "You really woke up one morning and decided to trade a rifle for charting." The corner of Lauren's mouth moved not quite humor. That is a romantic way to describe paperwork. He almost smiled. "You know what I mean." She did. The room did. The question was not about logistics. It was about motive. About how somebody crossed the distance between ending life at a distance and keeping it here up close. Lauren capped the pen. "I spent years learning what the body looked like when it was about to fail, she said. Breathing changes. Position changes. A shoulder goes wrong before the whole stance does. Hands tell the truth before a face does. In the field, seeing those things quickly kept people alive if you were good and got people killed if you were not. In medicine, it is not that different. The distance changed. The mission changed. The body didn't. Ava had stopped pretending to sort labels at all. That's why you saw him, she said. Before any of us. Lauren looked at her. I saw a pattern. Walker heard the correction and understood it instinctively. Lauren would always pull attention away from herself and toward process if given the choice. That, too, was familiar. In his own community, the most capable operators often did the same thing. Ego distorted detail. Detail kept people breathing. Ben spoke again, voice quiet enough to make the others lean in. You keep saying what you saw, not what you felt. Lauren's eyes found his. Feeling is less useful in the first 10 seconds. That isn't what I asked. For the first time since the reveal, something flickered across her face that might have been fatigue, not weakness, just the passing shadow of a door she had no interest in opening. No, she said. Ben let the silence hold. So what did you feel? Walker almost told him to leave it alone. Not out of pity, out of instinct. He knew the look people got when you asked them for the inside of something they had only agreed to describe from the outside. But Lauren surprised him by answering. I felt the room narrowing, she said. I felt every bad option in it. The old man in the chair, the child in the corner, oxygen on the wall, glass on the floor. 4 very capable men preparing to solve the wrong problem the right way. Micah let out a slow breath and looked away. Walker stayed very still. Lauren's voice remained flat, but there was a current under it now stronger than before, and I felt how fast fear spreads once one person stops seeing people and starts seeing threats. No one moved. Ava lowered the labels to her side. Heller had stopped at the far medication station, hidden partly by the partition, listening without making it obvious. Mr. Donnelly watched with the patient stillness of someone who had lived long enough to know when truth had entered a room and should not be interrupted. Walker rubbed his thumb once over the edge of the counter. You think that's what I was doing? Lauren met his eyes. In the first second, yes. He nodded because it was true. She looked down at his knuckles. And in your line of work, that response is often rewarded. In yours, it gets people hurt. In mine, it gets everybody hurt. He accepted that, too. The simple fact of being spoken to that directly with no contempt in it, only accuracy, stripped whatever defenses he still had left. Walker had spent a career taking correction from men he respected when a room required it. Pride survived that by adapting. He could feel his doing the same thing now, reluctantly at first, and then with a kind of clarity. You should have corrected me in the waiting room, he said. Lauren picked up the tablet again and scanned the intake board. To what end? Walker looked almost offended by the practicality of that. To stop me from sounding like an idiot. That was not my emergency. Micah laughed once helplessly, then covered it with a hand when he realized how badly timed it was. Dylan shook his head with something like admiration. Even Ava smiled despite the lingering tremor in her hands. Ben's expression remained thoughtful. You really never use it. Lauren glanced up. Use what? The fact that you've done things most people in this building will never understand. She considered the question for a second. Then she said, once you start asking the past to introduce you, people stop seeing what you're doing now. Heller, from the medication station, finally let himself smile. It was brief and almost private. He had known pieces of Lauren's record from credentialing and service documents, but hearing her say that explained more about the way she moved through the department than any file ever could. A call light chimed from Bay 3. Lauren's head turned automatically. Ava. The younger woman straightened. On it. She hurried off, grateful for something useful to do. The interruption broke the circle just enough for normal hospital motion to re-enter. A corpsman crossed with linens. An administrator asked Heller 2 clipped questions and was sent away with even fewer words than he'd used to ask them. The janitor finished sweeping the last of the glass. Somewhere overhead, the paging system crackled to life and announced a consult to another wing. Walker stayed where he was. "You said this is where you wanted to work," he said. "Why?" Lauren did not answer immediately. She was watching Bay 3 now, tracking Ava through the partially open curtain, making sure the intern's hands had stopped shaking enough to handle the patient safely. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, "Because I was tired of standing so far away from the outcome." The line settled into the air with such force that no one around her tried to fill the silence behind it. Walker thought he understood at once, and then realized he probably did not fully. Not the way she meant it. He could imagine pieces, a scope, a body on the far end of distance, a decision that reached a person before the person knew it was coming, a life altered by the steadiness of a trigger finger. The sterile room around them, bright and clean and full of damaged people trying to stay alive, suddenly felt like the far side of a bridge she had crossed alone. Lauren went on not because she owed them the rest, but because the sentence once started had chosen its own momentum. In combat, you can be perfect and still watch someone die. You can be wrong by an inch and live with it for years. You can do your job exactly as trained and still come home with a ledger in your head you never asked for. At some point, I knew I did not want the rest of my life measured only by what I could end. I wanted a job where seeing early meant there was still time to keep someone here. Micah lowered his eyes. Dylan's jaw tightened. Ben did not look away from her face. Walker found his own voice only after a moment. "So you became a nurse?" Lauren gave a short nod. "Not overnight." He almost asked how. School transition credentials, all the practical steps by which a person remade a life. But none of those questions mattered as much as the reason, and the reason was standing in front of him with hospital badge steady hands and the kind of gaze that had once belonged to another battlefield. Mr. Donnelly broke the silence from his wheelchair. "I like this version better." The room turned toward him. He shrugged one thin shoulder under the blanket, not because of what she was, because of what she did with it. Lauren went back to his chart. "You are not cleared to make speeches. Somebody has to." Walker looked at the old sailor, then at Lauren, and knew Mr. Donnelly had said aloud what the room had been circling. The respect he felt now was no longer built only on skill. Skill impressed him. Transformation landed deeper. Ava returned from Bay 3 with the look of a woman relieved to have performed a basic task correctly. "Temp is down after meds," she said. Lauren nodded. "Good." Ava hesitated, then looked at Lauren with the open earnestness of someone too young to hide admiration well. "Can I ask you something?" "You can. How do you stay that calm?" Micah shifted as if he wanted the answer too. Lauren capped another pen and set it beside the keyboard in a perfectly straight line. "I do not stay calm," she said. Ava frowned. That did not look true. It looked controlled. Ava waited. Lauren's eyes went briefly to the corridor where the patient had been taken. Calm is what people call it when they are watching from outside. Inside it is usually just sequence. You do the first right thing, then the next one, then the next. You do not ask your body how it feels until there is time for the answer. Ava absorbed that as if it might become part of her one day. "Sequence. Sequence," Lauren said. Walker let the word settle. It explained more than he expected. In his own world, men called it drills, flow mechanics, muscle memory. Lauren's version fit a hospital because she had made it fit a hospital. Same architecture underneath. Different walls. Heller crossed back toward them at last, chart tucked under one arm. "Chief Walker." Walker straightened automatically. "Sir, room 4 is open. You still need those stitches checked and that hand irrigated before you infect yourself with something stupid." Walker glanced at the dried blood and split skin across his knuckles. The injury felt childish now. "Yes, sir." Heller's eyes moved to Lauren. "You mind taking him once you settle Donnelly?" Lauren looked at Mr. Donnelly's current numbers and then at the bed status board. I can do that. Walker opened his mouth to say he could wait for another nurse. He was not sure whether the impulse came from discomfort or respect. Lauren had already turned back to the desk, signaling the conversation was over. Heller, catching the hesitation, said mildly, "She is in fact still allowed to practice medicine after startling all of you." Micah coughed to hide a laugh. Walker almost smiled. "Understood, sir." Heller moved on. Lauren printed a new armband for a fresh arrival, handed it to a corpsman, and then finally looked at Walker again. "Sit down in room 4 when they call you." There was no sting in the instruction. No revenge, just work. Walker nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Lauren's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Do not do that." He blinked. "Do what?" "Turn me into a symbol because you feel guilty." The words were so exact they pinned him in place. Micah looked at the floor. Ben's mouth tightened to hide the fact that he understood exactly what she meant. Walker held her gaze. "That is not what this is." "Good." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Walker said more carefully, "I respect what you did." Lauren reached for Mr. Donnelly's chart again. "Respect the job. It will serve you longer." He heard the correction and accepted it. Again. Ben pushed off the wall at last. "I am going to remember that." Lauren did not look up. "That is your burden." Ben gave the faintest smile. "Fair enough." Micah rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, most people would have milked this for the rest of the year." "Most people are exhausting," Lauren said. Dylan let out a low sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "You really do not change speed for anybody." Lauren looked at him. "I changed speed for your friend with the monitor." Dylan raised both hands slightly in surrender. Point taken. A corpsman arrived to take Mr. Donnelly to an open bay. Lauren stepped around the desk immediately. "Easy with him," she said. The corpsman nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Lauren did not correct him. Walker noticed that too. She only rejected the title when it shifted attention onto her. When it served the patient, she let it pass. Another calculation, another tiny proof of how precisely she handled the room. As the wheelchair rolled toward the bay, Mr. Donnelly reached out and caught Lauren lightly by the wrist for one brief second. She looked down. He looked up at her. "Good work, Marine." The old title sat between them without performance, without nostalgia. Just recognition from one generation of service to another. Lauren's face softened in a way Walker had not seen before. "Thank you, sir." Mr. Donnelly let go and the corpsman wheeled him onward. The ER moved around that exchange as though it had happened inside a pocket of separate time. Walker found himself standing there with his teammates, none of them quite ready to leave the desk. None of them with a reason strong enough to stay. The arrogance they had carried into the hospital had not merely been corrected. It had been absorbed and rendered irrelevant by somebody who had no use for humiliating them. That somehow made it land harder. Micah broke the silence first. "I said some things earlier." Lauren started updating the room board. "Yes, I was out of line. Yes." He waited, maybe expecting more, maybe hoping for absolution wrapped in humor. Lauren gave him neither. After a second, Micah nodded to himself. "All right." Dylan stepped closer. "Same." Lauren glanced at him. "Understood." Then Ben. He did not apologize immediately. He studied her a moment instead, as if choosing words that deserved the room. "I noticed the way you moved before any of this started," he said. "I just did not understand what I was looking at." Lauren held his gaze. "Now you do." "Yes." Ben nodded once. No more, no less. It felt complete. Walker was the last to speak, and because he was the last, the room seemed to wait for him. "I was leading the way in the wrong direction before you stopped me." Lauren's hands paused over the keyboard. "That happens fast," she said. He knew she was giving him room to keep his dignity if he wanted it. He did not take the escape. "It does," he said. "And I was wrong." She looked at him fully then. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied something, because the edge in her own eased by a degree. "Yes," she said, "you were." It was the cleanest apology he had ever received. No performance, no soothing, No need to make him comfortable while telling the truth. He nodded, thank you. Lauren turned back to the desk. Room 4. A corpsman at the end of the hallway called Walker's name almost on cue. He looked at his teammates. Micah gave a short nod. Dylan folded his arms. Ben's expression said nothing and everything at once. Walker started toward the exam room, then stopped and looked back one more time. Lauren had already returned to the work in front of her. Intake forms, vitals, bed assignments, Mr. Donnelly's transfer note. A nurse in the next bay asked where the spare blood pressure cuffs had gone, and Lauren answered without lifting her head. Ava brought over a chart for signature, and Lauren signed it. The whole department seemed to be leaning back into motion around her steady center, not because she had revealed who she used to be, because she had reminded everyone what she was now. Walker turned and headed for room 4, with the sharp sting in his hand and a quieter, heavier feeling in his chest, while behind him Lauren remained at the nurse's station under the hard white lights, writing people back into order one line at a time. Writing people back into order one line at a time, Lauren did not look up again until the call light over room 4 blinked twice. The gesture was not urgent, just steady, a reminder, not a demand. She finished the note already open. On her screen confirmed Mr. Donnelly's transfer status and slid the tablet back into its cradle. Around her, the emergency department had recovered its rhythm with the stubborn efficiency unique to hospitals. A mother soothed a flushed child in Bay 3. A corpsman pushed fresh linens past the nurse's station. Someone laughed softly at the far end of the hall, the sound brief and almost guilty, as if laughter had to ask permission after disruption. The smell of antiseptic had begun to bury the sharp electrical scent left by the broken monitor. Even the floor where glass had scattered now looked clean enough to erase what had happened there. Only the people had changed. Ava was more deliberate with her hands now. Micah and Dylan stood quieter than they had earlier, their shoulders no longer broadcasting ownership of the room. Ben had drifted toward the hallway, but every few seconds his eyes returned to Lauren as though some part of him was still replaying the geometry of the crisis and the way she had cut through it without force. Lauren reached for a fresh pair of gloves, slipped them on, and headed for room 4. Walker was sitting on the edge of the exam table when she entered. The room was small, spare, and cold, with off-white walls, a stainless steel tray on a rolling stand, and a blood pressure machine tucked into one corner beside a red Sharps container. A folded paper gown sat unopened on the counter. The overhead fluorescent panel hummed softly. There was a faint smell of rubbing alcohol and the stale dryness of recycled air. Walker looked up as she came in. For the first time that day, he seemed almost uncertain what to do with his size. Men like him usually filled rooms without trying. And here, with one cut hand resting on his knee and the memory of the trauma bay still between them, he looked less like a team leader and more like a man who had discovered that confidence and clarity were not always the same thing. Lauren crossed to the sink and washed her hands again, even though the gloves would cover them in another second. Which hand? He lifted the right. She glanced at the split skin across his knuckles. Hold it higher. He did. Lauren pulled the tray closer and checked the supplies in practiced silence. Saline, gauze, antiseptic, steri strips, suture removal scissors, a digital thermometer she did not need. A blood pressure cuff she probably would, because after what had happened she trusted numbers less than she trusted physiology, but she still liked having the numbers. Walker watched her set things in order. I meant what I said out there. Lauren opened a sterile packet and laid a folded pad on the tray. Most people do in the first 10 minutes after being humbled. His mouth tightened a fraction. Not angry, just willing to take the cut. I deserved that. Yes. She turned toward him and held out her hand. Give me the other one, too. He blinked. Why? Because if I am treating one hand and the other one shakes, I would like to know before you pretend it does not. A small huff of breath escaped him that might have become a laugh in any other room. He gave her the left hand. Lauren wrapped the cuff around his upper arm and started the reading. Walker looked at the machine, then back at her. You do this with everybody. I do this with people who look calm enough to lie. The cuff tightened. He sat still while it measured him, eyes drifting once to her face and then away. Lauren read the numbers and made no comment. Bad. Your body had adrenaline dumped into it in a medical waiting room 15 minutes ago. It has opinions. He nodded. Fair. She peeled the cuff away and reached for the saline. The first rinse stung enough to make his jaw set. He did not pull back. Lauren irrigated the cut with steady pressure, clearing dried blood and grit from the skin. The room stayed quiet except for the hiss of saline and the hum of lights overhead. Walker finally said, I keep replaying it. Lauren blotted his hand with gauze. That is also normal. The part I keep hitting is the second before you stopped me. She looked up. Why that second? Because I was sure. Lauren considered him briefly, then turned his hand under the light to get a better look at the torn skin. Being sure is expensive, she said. He gave a short nod. I know. No. Her voice stayed even. You know it in your world. In mine, certainty costs differently. She dabbed antiseptic across the split knuckle. He did not flinch this time. Walker watched her work. You saw me as part of the problem. Lauren adjusted his hand, angling the fingers straighter. For 1 second, yes, that bother you. It focused me. The answer sat between them, too clean to argue with. He let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said, I have worked with medics before. Corpsmen, good ones, calm people. But the way you moved out there felt like something else. Lauren reached for the adhesive strips. It was something else. You do not miss it. Her fingers paused over his hand. The question had arrived quietly, but it landed deeper than the others. Not because it was rude, because it assumed the old life sat behind her, waiting to be compared with the new one. And comparisons like that were rarely simple. I miss parts of being useful in a very narrow way, she said at last. I do not miss what came with it. Walker looked at her carefully. That is about as far as you are willing to go. For now. The answer was not a door opening. It was a door acknowledging itself. Walker accepted it. Lauren pressed the adhesive strips into place, drawing the edges of the split skin together with firm, exact pressure. Her hands were cool through the gloves. The cut was not deep enough for full closure, but it would heal clean if he did not keep breaking it open on equipment and ego. You are going to keep this dry, she said. He looked down at the dressing. Yes. You are also going to stop flexing it every time you get uncomfortable. His eyes lifted to hers. I was doing that. Yes. He almost smiled. You notice everything. No, just enough. She taped the gauze lightly, then stepped back to inspect the work. Walker rotated his wrist once, testing the dressing. You said earlier you came here because you were tired of standing far from the outcome. Lauren stripped off her gloves and dropped them into the trash. I said enough earlier. You did. He hesitated. Then he said, I do not think I have ever heard anybody put it that way. Lauren leaned one hip lightly against the counter, not relaxed exactly, but less in motion than she had been out in the department. Distance changes what your brain allows, she said. It has to. If it did not, you could not function. Then one day you realize you have gotten very good at reducing people to patterns because patterns are survivable. Useful, efficient, necessary, and then you come home and the world keeps handing you actual people. Walker sat with that. The room around them felt smaller suddenly, not from tension, but from concentration. Even the hum of the lights seemed to recede. Lauren went on because he was listening in the right way now, not hunting for something impressive, just trying to understand. In medicine, patterns still matter. Probably more than most people realize. But the pattern is attached to somebody 5 feet away who can hear your voice and feel your hands. Somebody whose fear changes when you look at them or do not. Somebody who might stay because you caught one thing early enough. I wanted that kind of work. Walker nodded slowly. To keep people here, yes. He looked down at his dressed hand again. That is a hell of a transition. Lauren reached for his chart on the counter. No, that is a hell of a reason. The transition was just paperwork in school and not sleeping enough for several years. That earned a real laugh from him, brief and low. Then his face settled again. I keep thinking about what you said, about turning fear into violence. Lauren started typing notes into the chart. It happens fast. I know. You know, when the room is built for violence. She glanced at him. Hospitals are worse because most people inside them are already losing something. He did not answer right away. In the hallway, a gurney rolled past with a soft rattle. Somewhere beyond the door, Ava asked a question, and another nurse answered. The whole building carried on around them as if this room were just one more space where damage was being managed. Walker looked at Lauren and said I saw scrubs and decided that meant support role. Safe role, clean role. Lauren kept typing. I know. I do not like that I did that. Then stopped doing it. The line landed without cruelty, just instruction. Walker exhaled slowly. You really leave nowhere to hide. Lauren saved the chart and set the tablet down. Hiding is inefficient. That almost made him laugh again. She checked his pupils with a penlight more from habit than necessity, then felt the pulse at his wrist for a few beats. Not because she needed to. Because the body still told the truth more clearly than pride did. You sleep much this week? Not enough. You hydrate. Probably not enough. Any dizziness? Only when my worldview gets rearranged. Lauren looked at him for a second. Then despite herself, she smiled. Small, brief, but unmistakable. There you are, Walker said softly. The smile vanished, though not unkindly. Do not make a thing out of that. Was not planning to. She stepped back and made one final note in the chart. You are physically fine. Your hand will heal. Your pride may take longer. He accepted that with a slow nod. As she moved toward the door, he said, Lauren. She paused with her hand on the handle. I appreciate that you did not let me keep being wrong after the room went bad. Lauren looked back over her shoulder. You were going to find out either way. That is not what I mean. She waited. Walker chose his words more carefully than he had chosen any all day. You could have made me feel smaller than I already did. Lauren studied him for a moment. Would that have improved your judgment? Number. Then it would have been a waste of time. He looked at her, and whatever response he had expected, it was not that one. Perhaps because it carried no moral height to stand on. She had not spared him out of generosity. She had simply refused to spend energy on anything that did not serve the room. Right, he said quietly. Lauren opened the door. Outside, the emergency department met them at full working volume again. Nothing dramatic. Just life layered on life. A corpsman carrying blood tubes to lab. A nurse checking a medication label against a bracelet. Heller dictating into a recorder while walking. Mr. Donnelly now settled in a bay with nasal cannula in place, his color a shade better than before. The child in Bay 3 had stopped crying and was now negotiating for juice in the solemn voice children used when they believed illness should earn them privileges. Lauren stepped into all of it without changing pace. Walker came out behind her and stopped near the nurse's station. His teammates were there waiting not because they needed him, but because none of them had wanted to leave yet. The energy between the four men had changed too. Less banter, more awareness. Micah looked at the dressing on Walker's hand. You survive. Apparently. Dylan glanced toward Lauren. How bad was the lecture? Walker flexed his fingers once, then thought better of it and stopped. Accurate. Ben gave the faintest nod as if that told him everything he needed to know. Lauren passed them on her way to Bay 2, checked a hanging IV bag, adjusted the roller clamp, and asked the patient 2 questions, in a tone so ordinary it almost erased the fact that half the room was still orienting itself around what she had revealed. Ava came up beside the 4 SEALs carrying a clipboard. You guys still need discharge paperwork eventually, she said. Micah looked at her. You sound tougher now. Ava blinked. Do I? Yes. She glanced at Lauren, then back at them. Maybe I had a good example. Walker followed that glance. Lauren was listening to a patient describe chest pain that had started during yard work. One hand rested lightly on the bed rail. Her face had gone fully professional again, all attention on the person in front of her. No trace of the sink conversation. No trace of Helmand. No trace of the trauma bay except the efficiency with which she now controlled every square foot around her. The thing that struck Walker hardest was how little she had changed from before the chaos. The room had changed. Their understanding had changed. She had simply remained herself long enough for everyone else to catch up. Heller strode by with a chart tucked under his arm and stopped when he saw the 4 operators still standing there. "You planning to live in my hallway?" Micah straightened. "No, sir." "Then move one direction or the other. You are alarming the civilians." There were no civilians in sight, but the point landed. The men shifted automatically toward the exit corridor. Walker looked back once. Lauren had just finished taking the chest pain history and was checking the patient's skin color, breathing pattern, and the set of his shoulders before she ever looked at the monitor. Sequence, he thought. First right thing, then the next one. As the 4 men walked toward the glass doors, they passed the nurse's station one at a time. Micah was first. He gave Lauren a small nod. "Take care." She looked up briefly. "Hydrate." He almost grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Lauren gave him a look sharp enough to make Ben cough into his fist to hide a laugh. Dylan came next. He touched 2 fingers lightly to the brim of his cap, not a salute, not theater, just acknowledgement between professionals. Lauren inclined her head once in return. Ben, he slowed the most. He met her eyes and said, "I am glad I know what I was looking at now." Lauren considered him for half a second. "That makes one of us." His mouth shifted at that, not quite a smile, but close. Then he moved on. Walker was last. For a moment, he stood beside the desk where earlier he had sat and made assumptions loud enough for the room to hear. The memory of it felt strangely distant now, as if it belonged to another version of him who had walked into the hospital convinced that danger announced itself in obvious forms. Lauren finished signing a medication request and looked up. Walker said, "Thank you for keeping the room from becoming something else." Lauren held his gaze. "That was everybody's work." He shook his head. "No, we were standing in your work." She did not correct him this time. Instead, she said, "Get some sleep before you start believing your own insight." Walker let out a breath that might once have been a laugh. "Yes, Lauren." This time, she let the name stand. He touched the brim of his cap in that same quiet gesture Dylan had used and turned toward the doors. The afternoon light beyond the glass was hard and bright white off the pavement and river water both. The 4 SEALs stepped out into it carrying their discharge papers, their minor injuries, and a new understanding they did not yet have language for. The doors side closed behind them. Inside, Lauren watched the reflection of the exit settle back into ordinary glass. Then she turned away. There was still work waiting. There would always be work waiting. A fever in Bay 3. Mr. Donnelly's repeat oxygen saturation. A fresh arrival with abdominal pain and too much bravado. Lab values to chase, notes to finish, supplies to restock. A frightened spouse near the vending machines trying not to cry in front of a child. Lauren picked up a chart and headed toward Mr. Donnelly's bay. He looked better with oxygen on. Tired, but less strained. He watched her approach with that same old sailor's gaze, part amusement, part appraisal. "They gone?" "Yes." He nodded, as if he had expected that. Looked like they learned something. Lauren checked the line at his nose and the saturation on the monitor. "They will decide that for themselves." Mr. Donnelly studied her face. "And you? What about me? You all right?" Lauren adjusted the blanket over his legs. "I am working." He gave a soft grunt that might have meant yes, that tracks. That is not an answer either. She met his eyes, and for a second there was no uniform between them, no age, no role, only 2 people who recognized what it cost to carry certain things quietly. Then Lauren said, "Yes, sir." Mr. Donnelly settled back. Good. She made a note in his chart and moved on. At the nurse's station, Ava handed her a lab slip with steadier fingers than before. "Room 6 wants to know if they can get water now." "Yes. Bay 3 temperature is down again." "Good." Ava hesitated. "You really mean it, don't you?" Lauren looked at her. "Mean what?" "Sequence. Lauren took the lab slip, read it, and set it beside the correct chart. It keeps you from drowning in the whole room. Ava nodded, like she was committing that to memory for much later. Then she hurried off to room 6. Lauren returned to the desk, entered 2 sets of vitals, signed 1 order, and checked the waiting list. Outside the windows, the afternoon kept burning bright over Portsmouth. Inside, the emergency department kept doing what it had always done, taking in damage, sorting it, naming it, holding the line between disorder and the narrow chances people called care. Lauren stood in the middle of that line, quiet as ever, and when the next call light blinked, she picked up her chart and went where she was needed.